The November air had a bite to it that promised a hard winter, the kind that froze the marrow in your bones. It was the same cold that had settled in Sarah's heart the day they lowered Frank into the hard, unforgiving Wisconsin soil. 3 days. It had only been 3 days since the funeral, and the casseroles from the church ladies were still half-eaten on the counter, monuments to a grief she hadn't yet had time to process. The smell of the barn, a familiar comfort of hay and warm Holstein, was now laced with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. She was in the milk house, her hands raw from the chlorine rinse as she washed the stainless steel buckets of the old Surge milker system. The rhythmic hiss and clank of the vacuum pump was the farm's heartbeat, a sound Frank had started every morning at 4:30 a.m. for 25 years. Now it was her sound, her responsibility, all of it. The 23 milk cows in the stanchions, the 80 acres of rolling land, the mortgage that was, thank God, paid off last spring, and the collection of machinery Frank had kept running with wire, sweat, and a near-religious devotion. A pair of heavy work boots scraped on the concrete just outside the door. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. The shadow that fell across the doorway was as broad and imposing as the man who cast it. "Sarah," Earl Thompson said. His voice was thick, used to giving orders over the roar of a diesel engine. He was Frank's cousin, but the two men had been like oil and water. Frank was cautious, methodical. Earl was all horsepower and ambition. "Earl," she replied, not stopping her work. She plunged a long-handled brush into a bucket of hot, soapy water and began scrubbing the inside of a milker claw. He stepped inside, bringing the cold with him. He was a big man, his frame packed tight inside a new Carhartt jacket that hadn't seen a spot of grease yet. He looked around the small milk house, his eyes lingering on the old single-basin wash sink and the bulk tank. A 300-gallon muller that seemed tiny compared to the new 1,000-galloners going in on farms around the county. His gaze was a judgment. "Tough time," he said, the words of condolence feeling like a formality he had to get out of the way. Frank was a good man. "Worked hard." "He did," Sarah said, her voice tight. Earl rocked back on his heels, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Listen, Sarah, I came over to talk business. I know it's soon, but things move fast. I was thinking about you, about this place." She stopped scrubbing and finally looked at him. His face was weathered from the sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "What about this place, Earl?" "Well, it's a lot for a woman to handle alone," he began, his tone dripping with false concern. "This old stanchion barn, milking with buckets, it's a young man's game, a strong man's game. And that machinery Frank kept, Lord have mercy, that old Farmall H he insisted on using for planting. It's a museum piece." Sarah felt a flash of anger. Frank loved that tractor. He could tune its 4-cylinder gasoline engine by ear, adjusting the carburetor's idle screw until it purred like a kitten. He knew every grease zerk, every quirk, every weak spot in its 60-volt electrical system. It wasn't a museum piece. It was a part of their life, paid for in cash 20 years ago. "The machinery works just fine," she said, her voice colder than the November wind. "For now," Earl conceded with a wave of his hand. "But you've got 23 cows. That's not a living anymore, Sarah. It's a hobby. The bank won't even look at you with a herd that small. You can't make improvements, can't get ahead. You'll work yourself into the grave, Frank's in, for nothing." He leaned against the doorframe, his bulk filling the space. "I'll make you a fair offer. A good one. More than anyone else would. I'll take the cows, the land, the whole works. You could take the money, buy a nice little house in town, join the ladies' auxiliary. It would be an easier life." His offer hung in the air, thick and greasy like diesel fumes. He wanted her land, the 80 acres she and Frank had poured their lives into. It bordered his own sprawling operation, and she knew he saw it not as a farm, but as a square on a map he needed to own. He was already milking over 100 head in a new freestall barn with a herringbone parlor. He had just traded up to a brand-new International Harvester 1066, a beast of a machine with a turbocharged diesel engine, a soundproofed cab, air conditioning, and a radio. He farmed with a checkbook, borrowing heavily from the PCA for the biggest and the best, while Frank had farmed with a wrench and a coffee can full of bolts. "No," Sarah said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the small milk house with the force of a slammed door. Earl blinked. He clearly hadn't expected it. No? Sarah, be realistic. What are you going to do? Haying season comes around, that old New Holland 469 haybine of yours is going to break down. What then? You think you can pull the wobble box and replace the bearings yourself? You think you can time the sickles? I'll learn, she said, turning back to her work, her movements sharp and deliberate. Frank taught me a lot. Frank taught you how to live in the past, Earl scoffed. The future is efficiency, gallons per man-hour, debt leveraging, things he refused to understand. He pushed himself off the doorframe. All right, suit yourself. But the offer stands. When you're stuck in a muddy field in April with that old John Deere 2-row planter and I'm cruising by in my 8-row cyclo, you'll think about it. When the price of milk drops and you can't cover your feed bill, you'll remember this conversation. Don't come crying to me then. He turned and left, his boots crunching away on the gravel drive. Sarah stood alone, the hum of the vacuum pump filling the silence. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was rage, a cold, hard anger that burned away a small piece of her grief and replaced it with something else. Resolve. He saw a weak, grieving widow. He was about to find out he was dealing with Frank's wife. She looked at the 23 Holstein cows placidly chewing their cud in the barn, their warm breath fogging in the cold air. They were her legacy, her future, and she'd be damned if she was going to let a man like Earl Thompson take it from her. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you folks, have you ever known someone who refused to take on debt, even when everyone else was? The kind of person who'd rather spend a weekend grinding valves and replacing head gaskets than sign a 5-year note on a new engine? Let me know in the comments below, because that was Sarah, through and through. She believed, just as Frank had, that the only thing you truly own is the thing you don't owe any man a dime on. And that belief was about to be tested in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The first test came sooner than she expected. The winter of '68 was brutal, a relentless assault of snow and ice that kept the cattle locked in the barn for weeks on end. The daily routine was a grueling rhythm of scraping manure, forking hay, and milking, her world shrinking to the 120-foot length of the old dairy barn. Spring arrived late, a muddy, sloppy affair that delayed planting. Earl, with his big 1066 and its massive tires, was in the fields the first day the ground was fit, his new 8-row planter laying down seed with brutal efficiency. Sarah had to wait another week for her fields to dry out enough for the old Farmall H. The H was Frank's pride. It wasn't powerful by 1960s standards, maybe 25 horsepower at the drawbar, but it was nimble and mechanically simple. Frank had added a non-factory 3-point hitch to it years ago, a modification that made it more versatile. Sarah climbed onto the cold steel pan seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The engine turned over slowly, then coughed to life with a puff of blue smoke and settled into its familiar, loping idle. She hitched up the old John Deere 290 2-row corn planter, a plate-type machine that Frank had kept in perfect working order. The planting was slow, methodical work. She'd watch the seed drop, listen to the click-clack of the marker arms, smell the rich, dark earth as the disc openers sliced it open. It was peaceful, but she was acutely aware of how far behind she was. By the time she finished her 30 acres of corn, Earl had already planted his 200 and was cultivating his first fields. The whispers started at the feed co-op. Poor Sarah, she heard one farmer say to another, still trying to make a go of it with that antique iron. It's a shame. She'll be broke by Christmas. They saw her struggle, but they didn't see her ledger book. Every bag of seed paid in cash. Every gallon of fuel paid in cash. No loan payments, no interest eating away at her milk check. The true trial came in the heart of summer during the first cutting of hay. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with humidity and the sweet smell of cut alfalfa. She was halfway through a 20-acre field, the New Holland 469 haybine laying down a perfect wide swath behind the farmall, when the machine began to vibrate violently. A god-awful screeching sound echoed across the field, followed by a loud bang. The PTO shaft seized, killing the tractor's engine. Silence, the sudden absence of noise, was more jarring than the failure itself, Sweat dripped down her face, mixing with the dust and chaff. She climbed down from the tractor, her heart sinking. She knew that sound. It was the sound of catastrophic failure. A quick inspection confirmed her fears. The wobble box, the heavy gearbox that converted the PTO's rotary motion into the sickle bar's back-and-forth cutting action, had self-destructed. A thick black gear oil was leaking from a crack in the cast-iron housing, and she could see shattered metal teeth through the hole. Earl would have called the dealer, a mechanic would have been out with a new unit, and he'd have been back to cutting hay in a few hours, with another $1,000 added to his line of credit. Sarah didn't have that option. She walked back to the farmhouse, her boots feeling like lead. In the machine shed, she pulled Frank's greasy service manual for the haybine off the shelf. For the next hour, she sat on an overturned bucket, wiping grease from the pages and studying the complex diagrams of the drive mechanism. The next 3 days were a descent into a greasy hell. She unbolted the heavy wobble box from the haybine's frame, using a chain hoist rigged to a barn beam to lift it onto the bed of her old Ford F-100 pickup. At the dealership in town, the parts man, a grizzled old-timer named Gus, shook his head. "Wobble box is shot, Sarah. Can order you a new one, but it'll take a week to get here, maybe more. And it'll cost you." "I don't have a week, Gus. The hay is down. It'll rain by the weekend." Gus chewed on his unlit cigar. "Well, we might have the parts to rebuild it. Bearings, seals, maybe a new shaft if that one's chewed up. But it's a tricky job. Gotta get the tolerances just right." "Sell me the parts," Sarah said. She spent the next 2 days on the floor of the machine shed, surrounded by wrenches, gear pullers, and cans of solvent. She disassembled the entire unit piece by piece, laying each gear, bearing, and shim out on a clean rag in the exact order she removed them. The old bearings had to be pressed out with a sledgehammer and a brass drift, a job that left her arms aching and her ears ringing. She cleaned 20 years of caked-on grease from the housing, found the crack, and took it to a local welder who stitched it back together for $10. Getting the new bearing races pressed in was the hardest part. She ruined the first one, driving it in crooked. The second one she put in the freezer for an hour and heated the housing gently with a propane torch. It slid in perfectly. Reassembling the gearbox was like solving a complex puzzle, setting the gear lash and bearing preload with a dial indicator and Frank's old feeler gauges. She packed it with fresh grease, her hands covered in the thick black substance. On the third afternoon, covered in grime from head to toe, she bolted the rebuilt unit back onto the haybine. She hooked up the PTO, took a deep breath, and started the farmall. Engaging the PTO, she braced for another failure. Instead, she heard a smooth, powerful whir. The sickle bar danced back and forth, clean and fast. She had done it. As she drove back into the field to finish cutting, she saw Earl's big red International baling hay in the field across the road. He slowed as he passed, looking at her and her old haybine. He didn't wave. He just shook his head with a smirk on his face, a look that said, "You're still playing in the little leagues." Sarah didn't care. The haybine was running. It hadn't cost her $1,000. It had cost her 3 days of sweat and every bit of her grit. And in that moment, that felt like a bigger victory than anything Earl could understand. The years began to stack up, each one a new chapter in the story of Sarah's survival. The farm community watched her, a constant subject of gossip at the diner and the sale barn. They saw her patching tires by hand, saw her welding cracked loader buckets, saw her driving fence posts with a manual pounder instead of a hydraulic one. They saw struggle. They didn't see the slow, steady progress. She was meticulous with her herd. Frank had been a good cowman, but Sarah had a gift for it. She kept detailed records in a spiral notebook, tracking milk production, breeding dates, and carving E's for every single cow. She learned the subtle signs of a cow in heat, the restless pacing, the bellowing for a bull that wasn't there. She used artificial insemination exclusively, poring over sire catalogues from American Breeders' Service, choosing bulls not for show ring looks, but for solid production, udder health, and longevity. Her first crop of heifers, born that first spring after Frank died, were beauties. They were strong, deep-bodied animals, and when they entered the milking string 2 years later, they consistently outproduced their mothers. Her herd average began to creep up. 23 cows became 28, then 32, then 37, all from her own replacements. She never bought a single animal. Every new stanchion filled was a testament to her own careful management. She culled ruthlessly, selling any cow with chronic mastitis or breeding problems. Her milk check, once barely enough to cover bills, started to show a small but steady surplus. The early 1970s arrived, and with them a change in the economic weather. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the US wheat crop. The deal, which came to be known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, soybeans, and wheat doubled, then nearly tripled in price. And where grain prices went, everything else in agriculture followed. Land values soared, the price of milk shot up. For the first time in a generation, it felt like a farmer could get rich. A wave of intoxicating optimism swept through the heartland. It was the era of fence-row to fence-row planting, encouraged by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz. The message from Washington, from the banks, from the equipment dealers was clear: get big or get out. Borrow money, expand. The future is now. No one embraced this new religion more fervently than Earl Thompson. The soaring value of his land gave him immense borrowing power, and he used every penny of it. He bought the 120-acre farm on the other side of Sarah's property, paying a price that would have been unthinkable just 2 years prior. He traded in his 1066, which was barely 3 years old, for a brand-new International Harvester 1466. This new tractor was the king of the county, its turbocharged engine putting out a deafening roar, black smoke pouring from its chrome stack. He bought a new 6-bottom plow to go with it, a 20-foot disc, and a new Gleaner combine. His biggest monument to this new era of prosperity was a massive cobalt blue harvester silo that towered over the landscape. It was a symbol of modern scientific farming, a sealed oxygen-limiting structure that promised perfect silage. It also came with a price tag and a mortgage that made old-timers shake their heads in disbelief. Earl was a hero at the local Production Credit Association office, his picture on their wall, the model of the progressive American farmer. He would often stop his pickup at the end of Sarah's lane. He'd watch her for a few minutes as she chugged along on the old Farmall H, now cultivating corn with a rusty 2-row cultivator. The H looked like a child's toy next to his new 1466. He saw her as a fool, a stubborn woman clinging to the past, missing the single greatest opportunity in agricultural history. She's sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig, he told everyone at the co-op. But Sarah saw things differently. She saw the rising prices not as a ladder to climb with borrowed money, but as a roof to fix before the next storm. She resisted the siren song of the bankers and the equipment dealers. Her neighbors were putting up new pole sheds. Sarah put a new steel roof on her old barn, paying the roofer in cash. Her neighbors were buying new tractors. Sarah spent a winter in her shop, giving the Farmall H a complete engine overhaul. She pulled the head, had the valves ground, put in new sleeves, pistons, and rings. When she painted the engine block in fresh Farmall red, it looked and ran like it was brand new. She used the extra income from the higher milk prices to improve what she had, not to acquire more. She invested in better genetics for her cows. She tiled a wet spot in her lower field that had always been a problem, hiring a local man with a backhoe and paying him the day the job was done. She bought a slightly used New Holland bale wagon, a purchase that saved her back and countless hours of labor in the haymow, and she paid for it with a single check. By 1974, 3 years after Frank's death, her herd had grown to 46 milking cows. She had doubled her herd without borrowing a single dollar. Her barn was full, and her cows were some of the best in the county. But on paper, she was a failure. Her net worth hadn't exploded like Earl's. She hadn't expanded her acreage. She was still driving a 25-year-old tractor. The community saw her as a timid eccentric, a woman who had missed the boat. One cool autumn evening, Sarah stood on her back porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of harvested cornfields. Across the valley, the yard light on Earl's farm clicked on, illuminating his massive blue silo and the gleaming red paint of his new machinery, all lined up in a neat, impressive row. They looked like an army, ready for conquest. She then looked at her own machine shed, where the familiar shape of the Farmall H sat in the deepening shadows. It was small, old, and paid for. On the kitchen radio, a news announcer was talking. The words were just background noise until a few phrases cut through the static. Runaway inflation, he said. The Federal Reserve, rising interest rates, uncertainty in the global markets. A man's name was mentioned, someone new at the Fed. A man named Paul Volcker, who was said to be a hawk on inflation. Sarah didn't know what it all meant, not really, but a cold feeling, a sense of deep unease, settled in her stomach. The boom felt too good to be true, it felt brittle, and as she looked at Earl's empire of debt across the valley, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hard winter she had feared all those years ago was still coming. And it wouldn't be a winter of snow and ice, but of something far, far colder. The good years, as everyone later called them, ended as abruptly as they had begun. The first sign was the dust. The summer of 1980 was hot and dry, the sky a pale, hazy blue for weeks on end. Corn leaves curled in on themselves by midday, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The creek slowed to a trickle, then disappeared into cracked mud beds. Sarah's corn, planted on fields she had carefully managed with crop rotation and manure from her herd, held on, its roots driven deep into the soil. But Earl's corn, planted fence row to fence row on land that had been pushed hard for years, began to suffer. The lower leaves yellowed and died, the stalks stunted and brittle. Then came the news from the television, a cold pronouncement from a world away that landed like a stone in the heart of the Midwest. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The export market, the very foundation of the commodity boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator fell 30 cents a bushel in a single day, then another 20 the next. A collective gasp went through the farming community. The second blow landed not in the fields, but in their mailboxes. The letters came on crisp bank letterhead, the language polite but firm. Due to new policies at the Federal Reserve to combat inflation, interest rates on all variable rate operating loans were being adjusted. The prime rate, which had hovered in the single digits for years, was climbing. 10%, 12, 15. By harvest time, it was pushing an unthinkable 18%. For Sarah, the news was troubling but not catastrophic. Her only debt was her monthly bill at the feed co-op, which she paid in full every time, but for Earl it was a death sentence. His entire operation, the new land, the 1466, the Gleaner Combine, the massive Blue Harvest store, was financed with variable rate loans. The interest payments alone were now more than his entire income had been 5 years prior, and that income was shrinking by the day. The first visible crack in his empire appeared in late August. Sarah was driving home from town in her old Ford pickup when she saw it. Earl's massive International 1466 was sitting dead in the middle of a field, a plume of blue-white smoke hanging over it like a funeral shroud. Earl was standing beside it, his hands on his hips, staring at the engine as if he could intimidate it back to life. Sarah knew what that kind of smoke meant. A catastrophic engine failure, likely a scored piston or a blown turbocharger, an expensive, complicated repair that was far beyond the scope of a farm shop overhaul. A week later, she saw a flatbed truck from the dealership haul the tractor away. It didn't come back. Instead, Earl was working his fields with a smaller, older tractor, a 10-year-old John Deere 4020 he must have bought or borrowed. It was a good tractor, but it was no match for the implements the 1466 had pulled. His full tillage was slow, his progress agonizing. The whispers at the co-op changed their tune. The awe at Earl's expansion turned to nervous speculation. Heard the bank put him on a cash-only basis, one farmer said, leaning against a pallet of feed sacks. Heard he had to sell 100 head of his young stock just to cover the interest payment for September. Sarah saw the change in the man himself. The swagger was gone. His face, once ruddy and confident, was now pale and drawn, his eyes carrying the haunted look of a man who hears wolves circling in the dark. He stopped driving his new pickup, switching to an old beat-up farm truck to save fuel. One afternoon, Sarah was in the machine shed, grinding a sickle bar for her haybine, when Earl's truck pulled into her lane and stopped. He got out and walked slowly toward her, his boots scuffing in the gravel. He didn't look at her at first, his eyes fixed on the Farmel H. "That old thing," he said, his voice rough. "Still running, huh?" "She always does," Sarah replied, switching off the grinder. The silence hummed between them. "The turbo went out on the 1466, he finally said, looking at the ground. "Took the whole engine with it. Dealer wants $12,000 for a rebuild. 12,000. He said the number like it was a foreign word he couldn't comprehend. "The bank. They won't extend the credit." Sarah just nodded, wiping her greasy hands on a rag. There was nothing to say. "You were right," he mumbled so quietly she almost didn't hear him. "You and Frank. You were right. I built a house of cards, Sarah, and the wind is starting to blow." He turned without another word, got back in his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the scent of desperation hanging in the air. Sarah watched him go, feeling no sense of victory. She just felt a profound, aching sadness for the storm that was about to break over all of them. The winter of 1981 was the coldest anyone could remember, but the chill that gripped the countryside had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold, hard chill of fear. The local paper, once filled with stories of bumper crops and 4-H achievements, now had a new section. Notices of foreclosure. Every week, another family name appeared in the stark, black print. The farm auction became a weekly ritual, a grim gathering of neighbors who came not to buy but to bear witness, their faces etched with the terrifying thought, "Am I next?" These weren't auctions of retiring farmers, they were funerals for family legacies. Men who had been pillars of the community now stood silently at the edge of the crowd, watching as the auctioneer sold off the tractors their fathers had bought, the cows their grandfathers had bred, the very land that held their family history. The prices were heartbreaking. A tractor that cost $50,000 2 years ago might sell for 15. Good dairy cows sold for butcher prices. The bankers were the only ones who seemed to benefit, buying back the assets for pennies on the dollar. Sarah survived the winter by tightening her belt until it creaked. The price of milk was so low it barely covered the cost of feed and electricity. She stopped buying anything she couldn't produce herself. She repaired her own clothes, canned vegetables from a massive garden, and heated her small farmhouse with wood she cut from her own woodlot. Her cows, bred for resilience and fed on the high-quality hay and silage she grew herself, kept producing. Her milk check was small, but it was steady, and more importantly, it was all hers. Not a single penny of it went to a bank for an interest payment. The inevitable notice for Earl Thompson's auction appeared in the paper on a Tuesday in early April. The listing was long and devastating. It included the 120 acres he had bought during the boom, his entire line of modern machinery, and his herd of 150 Holstein cows. It was the complete liquidation of an empire. On the day of the auction, the sky was a low, oppressive grey, spitting a cold drizzle. A huge crowd had gathered, parking their trucks up and down the road for half a meal. Sarah parked her Ford and walked up the long lane to Earl's farmstead. The place looked shabby, neglected. Weeds were growing up around the foundation of the house. The gleaming red paint on the machinery was faded, splattered with mud. She saw Earl standing near the house, talking to the banker. He looked like a ghost. He had lost weight, and his expensive Carhartt jacket hung on his frame. His wife stood beside him, her face a mask of quiet grief. Sarah's heart ached for them. This wasn't a business failure, it was a public shaming. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, started with the small items, tools, feed bunks, spare tires. Then he moved to the machinery. The big 6-bottom plow sold for a fraction of its value. The Gleaner combine, Earl's pride and joy, went for less than the cost of a new pickup truck. When the auctioneer started the bidding on the International 1466, which had been repaired and sat gleaming in the rain, there was a long, awkward silence. No one wanted a fuel-guzzling monster with a $12,000 engine job. It finally sold to an out-of-state salvage dealer. Then came the land. The auctioneer described the 120-acre parcel, the same one that bordered Sarah's farm. "Good, productive land," he bellowed, "a fine addition to any operation." He asked for an opening bid. Silence. The local farmers stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. No one had the money or the nerve to buy land in this climate. The banker, looking impatient, stepped forward and gave a lowball bid, the amount Earl still owed on it. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd. "Surely we can do better than that, folks. A prime piece of Wisconsin farmland." Sarah, who had been standing quietly at the back, felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just land. This was the land Frank had always said would be a perfect pasture for their heifers. This was the land Earl had used as collateral to build his house of cards. Taking it back felt like setting something right. "I'll bid," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Every head turned to look at her. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. The banker, a man in a crisp suit that looked out of place in the mud, turned and glared at her, annoyed. He raised her bid. Sarah raised it back. They went back and forth, the numbers climbing slowly. The crowd was dead silent, watching the spectacle of the small, unassuming widow in a worn work coat bidding against the powerful First National Bank. Sarah knew exactly how much she had in her savings account, the cash she had carefully squirreled away during the good years. She knew her limit. The bidding reached her final number. The banker conferred with his colleague, then shook his head. He was done. "Sold," the auctioneer shouted, his hammer falling with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. To the lady in the back. A quiet ripple of applause went through the crowd of farmers. It wasn't just for her, it was against the bank. It was a small victory in a war everyone else was losing. Sarah walked to the clerk's table, her legs shaking slightly, and wrote out a check for the full amount, draining her savings account to the last dollar. As she signed her name, she felt a profound sense of peace. She hadn't just bought land, she had bought her future, free and clear. The days following the auction were a blur of paperwork and quiet satisfaction. The deed was filed, the land was hers. The first thing she did was walk the fence line that now separated her original 80 acres from her new 120. She ran her hand over the rusted barbed wire, the same fence Earl had once looked over with such ambition and pity for her. Now it was all hers. The land was tired, the soil compacted from years of heavy machinery and aggressive tillage, but it was good land. She knew she could bring it back. A week later, as she was fixing a gate leading into the new property, Earl's old truck rumbled up the lane and stopped. He got out, looking even more defeated than he had at the auction. He had lost everything except the house and a few acres around it. "Sarah," he said, his voice raspy. He stood on his side of the fence, a man who was now a visitor on land he had once owned. "Earl," she replied, her tone gentle. He stared at the ground for a long moment. "They said you bought it, the whole parcel." "I did." He finally looked up and she saw tears welling in his eyes. I wanted to say, congratulations. You deserved it. You earned it." He swallowed hard. "I'm a fool, Sarah. I was so busy chasing the horizon, I didn't see the cliff right in front of my feet. I mortgaged my family's future for a new tractor and a shiny silo. Frank," he tried to tell me, he said, "debt is a quiet thief, Earl. It takes a little every day until one day you wake up and you've got nothing left." I called him an old fool. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Turns out I was the fool all along. Sarah looked at this broken man, her cousin, and felt a wave of compassion wash away any lingering resentment. There was no victory in his defeat. They were both just people trying to hold on to a piece of the earth. "What will you do now, Earl?" she asked softly. He shrugged, a gesture of complete hopelessness. "Look for work in town, I guess. I don't know how to do anything else. I don't know how to be anything else but a farmer." Sarah thought for a moment, an idea forming in her mind. It was a risk, but it felt right. "This land needs a lot of work to bring it back," she said, nodding toward the new fields. "The soil is hard. It needs hay planted on it for a few years, needs livestock to graze it. I've got the cows, but I don't have enough time to manage another 100 acres properly." She looked him straight in the eye. "I need a good herdsman, Earl, someone who knows cows. And I'm going to need help putting up hay on this new ground. I'll pay you a fair wage. And," she added, "I've got an old tenant house on the back of my original property. It's small, but it's sound." You and your family could live there, rent-free, as part of the job." Earl stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He seemed unable to process her offer. She was offering him not just a job, but a home. She was offering him a way to stay on the land, a way to keep his hands dirty and his dignity intact. "Why?" he finally choked out. "After everything, why would you help me?" Sarah leaned against a fence post, her gaze drifting over the rolling hills that stretched out before them. "Because Frank wouldn't have wanted to see you lose everything," she said simply, "and because this community is better when we help each other up instead of watching each other fall. We're all we've got out here." Earl nodded slowly, the tears now flowing freely. He wiped them away with the back of his rough hand. "I'd be honored to work for you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." The years that followed were healing years, for the land and for the people. Earl proved to be a phenomenal herdsman. Freed from the crushing weight of debt and the pressure of constant expansion, he rediscovered his love for the animals. He had a gentle touch with a sick calf and an uncanny eye for a productive cow. He and Sarah worked as a team, their skills complementing each other perfectly. She managed the books and the crops. He managed the herd. Together they turned the farm into one of the most respected, efficient and profitable dairies in the county. They never got big, but they got better. They focused on soil health, on cow comfort, on quality over quantity. The community's perception of Sarah had transformed completely. The woman they once pitied as a backward-looking eccentric was now regarded with something approaching reverence. She was the one who had seen the storm coming. She was the one who had weathered it without flinching. Younger farmers, struggling to get started in the aftermath of the crisis, would often stop by her farm. They wouldn't ask for financial advice. They'd ask her to show them how to set the timing on an old distributor or how to diagnose a problem in a haybines knotter. She taught them the old ways, not as a rejection of the new, but as a foundation for survival. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years later, Sarah stood on her back porch. She was older now, her hair streaked with grey, her hands permanently calloused and strong. Her son, Frank Jr., a young man with his father's quiet eyes and his mother's steady hands, was in the machine shed. She could hear the familiar sound of a wrench clanking against steel. He was working on the old Farmall H, which was still used for light chores around the farm. Earl, now a grandfather himself, was moving the herd from one pasture to another, his border collie weaving expertly at the cow's heels. He looked over and gave Sarah a wave, a gesture of easy friendship forged over 2 decades of shared work and mutual respect. Her son came out of the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got the carburetor rebuilt, Mom," he said with a proud smile. "She's purring like a kitten again." "Good," Sarah said, putting an arm around his shoulders. They stood together, looking out over the farm. The fields were lush and green, the cows fat and content. Her original 80 acres and the 120 she had bought from Earl were now one seamless, thriving whole. The massive blue harvest store on the neighboring farm, long since abandoned, stood as a silent, rusting monument to a bygone era of dangerous ambition. "You know," her son said, "I was talking to one of the guys from the bank at the feed mill. He said we could get a loan for a new tractor, a big one with a cab and air conditioning. Said our balance sheet is one of the strongest in the county." Sarah smiled, a slow, knowing smile. She looked at the old Farmall H, its red paint faded, but its engine sound. She thought of her late husband, Frank, and the simple, powerful truths he had lived by. She thought of the long, hard years of struggle, the greasy nights in the machine shed, the terror and triumph of the auction. "Let me tell you something your father taught me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The land doesn't care if your tractor is new. It only cares that you respect the soil. The cows don't care how big your barn is. They only care that their beds are dry and their bellies are full. And never, ever let a man in a suit own one drop of your sweat. What we have here," she said, sweeping her arm across the landscape, "we built ourselves. We don't owe anyone a single dime for it. And that, son, is a feeling no bank loan can ever buy." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Together they watched the sun begin to set, casting long shadows across the fields they had fought for and saved. The farm was quiet, at peace, its heartbeat the steady rhythm of a life built not on credit or chance, but on resilience, wisdom, and the enduring strength of the land itself.